Hello, welcome to Science with Mrs. Blackburn. In this episode, we are going to be talking about energy and ecosystems. What energy is, what it's going to do, and how it's going to flow through ecosystems. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we need to know is that matter and energy are way different from one another, but they do have some similarities. So let's get that straightened out before we move ahead. We have been talking about matter in the past couple of episodes, and we know that matter can cycle through ecosystems. Matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. It's made of atoms, and these atoms can't be created or destroyed ever. They're just going to move through ecosystems. They're going to go through chemical and physical changes and make up different materials. Energy is a little bit different, however. Energy is going to be the ability to do work. Energy is not made of atoms. It's basically the potential to get something done. Now, like we said before, matter will cycle through ecosystems. An atom can end up in a very similar place than it was before at some point. For example, a water molecule could end up back in the atmosphere where it had been before. This is not the case with energy. Energy is going to flow instead of cycles. It's not going to end up where it was before, and you will see what I mean here in a little bit. Now, here is where matter and energy are similar. We have something called the law of conservation of energy. That might sound familiar because we've talked about the law of conservation of mass before. We know that matter can't be created or destroyed. We've talked about how all the atoms on Earth have always been here. They'll always be here. They can't be destroyed. The same thing goes with energy. Energy can't be created or destroyed. Energy is just going to change forms, okay? So, what are the forms that energy can take? Well, energy can change form. We can have energy like thermal energy. That would be heat energy. We can have chemical energy. Chemical energy is the type of energy that's found in foods and found in things like gasoline. When you burn gas to make your car go, that is a chemical reaction. That's a chemical energy that you're burning. Same as when you eat a hamburger. It's making you be able to do all the things that you do because there's energy in that food. We have light energy that comes from the sun. We can even make this energy artificially. I shouldn't say make energy because energy can't be created or destroyed, but we can generate it artificially in some ways. We also have electrical energy. And we even have things like sound energy, and each of these types can be even subdivided into more types of energy. But these are kind of the main ones that we talk about. So all these different types of energy can transform into one another, okay? For example, chemical energy that is in gasoline can power a car to go, okay? That would give that car kinetic energy where it moves. That's one that I don't have on the slide. And if you notice, your car gets a little bit heated when it runs because that chemical energy is converting into thermal energy. Same thing with you. The energy that you are using to move around comes from the food that you ate. And if you've ever noticed, we produce our own heat as well. So that's chemical energy turning into thermal energy. So we could go on and on and on for a whole school year about this topic. And as a matter of fact, in 7th grade, you'll talk a whole lot more about it. But this is just the basics to let us know that there are different types of energy that can be transformed into one another. For this episode, we will mostly be talking about chemical energy, light energy, and thermal energy. So, something that we need to know is that the chemical energy, that food energy, is going to be important for living things to be able to do anything at all, okay? Living things need energy, whether it's a plant, whether it's a human, whether it's a dog or a squirrel or a mouse or a frog, or even the tiniest bacteria. These living things will need energy to do what they've got to do. Now, there are special types of organisms that can make their own food for energy using chemicals or light. So we've been talking about ecosystems, okay? And we know that there are all different types of living and non-living things in ecosystems, and all of these living things need energy. So how do they get energy in the first place? Well, that comes from producers, okay? Producers are organisms that can make their own food using chemicals or light. Now, really important point here, all the energy on Earth that we have available to us is going to originate from the sun, okay? The sun is where all the energy on Earth is going to start. And then from there, it gets transformed into all those different types we talked about a minute ago, okay? So that's what's important to know. The only connection between the sun and us, okay, or anything else on Earth is going to be a producer. Producers are organisms that can make their own food using chemicals or light. So let's talk about that for a moment. This really important process called photosynthesis is the process that most producers use to make their own food. And it's something that is going to be so important as you learn about living things this year, next year, as long as you study science. So I love photosynthesis because it's so important. So what is photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is the process where plants, or sometimes bacteria, algae, things like that, are going to use energy from the sun to make their own food. It's basically a transfer of light energy to chemical energy. Now remember, a few minutes ago, I showed you the picture of the hamburger and said that was chemical energy because food is chemical energy. So let's talk about what's going on in this picture here. We've got the sun. Remember, all the energy on Earth starts with the sun. And I have a plant here, and what's going to happen is the plant is going to absorb sunlight. There's a lot of structures inside this leaf that you see here that are making this possible. We're not going to go into that yet. We're just going to talk about the basics. So, plant's going to take in the sunlight. It's also going to take in water, okay? And it will also take in carbon dioxide. So, 3 things are going to go into this plant: sunlight, water, carbon dioxide. I'm going to make a point now. The sunlight is energy. Water, carbon dioxide are matter. So the plant is going to have to take in energy and matter to do this process. Okay? What comes out of this process? Something called glucose. It's a sugar. It's the food that the plant will quote unquote eat for energy. And the plant will release oxygen as a waste product. Now this goes right along with what we've already talked about. We already said that we knew that plants took in carbon dioxide and let out oxygen. They do this through the process of photosynthesis. Now I will say a couple of things about the structure on the leaf because I can't help myself. I love it. So what lets the carbon dioxide in and the oxygen out, you might ask? They're actually tiny little pores on the undersides of leaves and plants called stomata. And if you were to look under a microscope, they look like tiny little mouths almost. They're little holes, and they let these gases in and out. And of course, the water is going to go through the roots, and the sunlight will be absorbed by special little structures in the plant cells called chloroplasts. They're filled with a pigment called chlorophyll, which is going to absorb that sunlight and allow all of this to happen. Now that is just the basic photosynthesis 101. Again, this is something that you could talk about for months because it's really way more complicated than this. But what we need to realize is that the most important parts are the plant takes in sunlight, that's energy, water and carbon dioxide, that's matter, and is going to release a chemical energy called glucose, which is a sugar made of molecules, it's matter, and it's going to also let out oxygen gas, which is also matter. So this is how ecosystems are connected to the energy from the sun. It's through this process, light energy to chemical energy. Now there's also something else. There are places on Earth that don't have access to sunlight very easily. Places like deep down in the ocean. There are a lot of tiny little organisms in the ocean that can do something called chemosynthesis. This is a process where producers make their own food from chemicals instead of light. So places like deep ocean vents, where there's not a lot of sun, there are special bacteria that can do a similar process to photosynthesis, only instead of taking in water and sunlight and carbon dioxide, they're taking in special chemicals to make their own food. That's how they are the producers in those ecosystems. So we have producers who can make their own food. Well, what about things like us? Now, if we want to make our own food, we have to go to the kitchen, right? We can't go stand out in the sun and say, oh, I'm full now. Okay, we have to run around McDonald's or go into our kitchen and make a peanut butter and jelly or something. We're called consumers. A lot of organisms are consumers, and there are specific types of consumers. So let's review that really quickly. We have herbivores, things like deer and cows and goats and things like that. And they're going to obviously eat plants. They will eat those producers. We have omnivores, which will eat meat and plants. Things like bears are good examples of omnivores, raccoons. Okay, and us, we're really good examples of omnivores because we eat lots of different foods. Carnivores are going to eat meat, things like wolves and lions. And again, sometimes some of us are more carnivores than omnivores, right? Who loves bacon? I know I do. And then, hopefully none of us are these things. Well, I guess we kind of are, but not really. These are detritivores. They will eat dead things. Technically, when we eat meat, we're eating dead things, but this is a little bit different. They're going to feed on dead things in a different way. These are things like most fungi will be detritivores. You've got certain types of bacteria. That's kind of why dead things smell, because bacteria are feeding on them and letting out specific gases that don't smell pleasant to us. And then you have things like vultures, which would be considered detritivores. More specifically, those would be scavengers. So, those are the different types of consumers. So you have two main categories of how the energy is going to start moving through these ecosystems. We have producers, which are going to be the connection between the sun and all living things on Earth. And then you have consumers, which are going to consume those producers in some way, whether it's directly or indirectly. So here's the important thing. Energy is going to flow through an ecosystem because living things need energy for life functions. They're going to have to eat. That's basically what this means. So we have something called a food chain, which you've probably heard of before. Food chains are models that show how that energy is flowing. It's going to show what is the producer in this ecosystem, what are the consumers in this ecosystem, where's that energy going. So let's look at one really carefully. So all food chains are going to begin with what? The sun. Again, like I said, the energy source for the earth is going to be our sun. So that's technically the very bottom of the food chain. We have to have a producer, a plant, or like I said before, there are certain special bacteria, algae, things like that, who can do photosynthesis. So you have to have a producer to do photosynthesis to turn that light energy into chemical energy or food. Then you're going to have a consumer, like a rabbit that's going to eat the plant. The rabbit can't do photosynthesis, so he can't get the energy directly from the sun, so he's going to have to eat the plant to get the energy that the plant got from the sun. Well, there's more than just this rabbit out there. We have things like snakes. Well, this snake needs to eat too. He needs energy to do whatever he's got to do as a sneaky, slithery little snake, okay? So he's going to eat the rabbit who ate the plant that was able to do photosynthesis to get the light energy. And then finally, it doesn't end with him. We have a hawk who has to go do hawk things and is going to eat that snake. Now, this shows how that energy flows from the sun all the way through that ecosystem. So that is just a basic food chain. Now here's another important thing to know. The amount of energy decreases with each transfer from one living thing to another. So I'm going to go back to the other graphic and show you. The living thing that got the most energy in this food chain would be that plant, because it's the first step, it's the most direct step from the sun to that chemical energy. Now, as we go through the food chain, some of the energy is quote unquote lost. Now, we said energy can't be created or destroyed. That's true, okay? It can't be created or destroyed, but it can be transferred. Remember how I said earlier, like when we run around, as a human, you've experienced this. If you walk around, run around, you feel body heat. Even if you're just sitting here breathing, you're going to generate body heat. That's some of the chemical energy in your body being transferred to heat energy. So some of the energy that goes through these animals, these consumers, through the process of eating, is going to be transferred to things like heat, sound, movement, like that. So the snake, for example, isn't going to get all the energy that bunny got from the plant. The hawk won't get all the energy that the snake got from the bunny, because some of that energy will be quote unquote, I'm doing little finger quotes, you can't see me, but I am. It's going to be quote unquote lost through the process. Is it really lost? It's not going to just go away or disappear magically. It's going to be transferred to heat, sound, movement, things like that. So that's just something very important to know about this process. Now, food chains are the most simplistic model that can show us what's happening with energy in an ecosystem. A food web is an actually way more accurate view of how this works. A food web is going to show all the energy transfers in an ecosystem, or the majority of them. So here is an example of a food web. I like this one because it's a marine food web, which means it's happening in the ocean. And as you can see, this is way more complex than the plant, bunny, snake, hawk example I gave you in the food chain. We have all sorts of organisms here and all sorts of arrows. These arrows are going to show the direction of energy flow. That's also another important thing that I probably should have said in the last part. When we use models like food chains and food webs, the arrow is pointing in the direction of energy flow. It's telling you where that energy is going. So if we look at this big food web and want to know where all of this started, where our producer is, we're going to look here at the bottom where no arrows are pointing to. It all starts with these phytoplankton. These phytoplankton are going to be the producers. These are tiny little microorganisms that are found in the ocean, and they're not plants, they're little animals basically. Some of them are very plant-like because they can do photosynthesis, okay? And I probably shouldn't say all of them are animals. We got some more specific types of organisms than animals, but a lot of them are tiny little animal-like organisms that can do photosynthesis. And they're going to be the basis of these marine food chains. Now, as you notice on this food web, if you trace each of these arrows, you're looking at separate food chains that are all in one picture, because a lot of these animals are part of different food chains. For example, the krill, this guy looks pretty popular. He's a pretty popular food source because look how many arrows are going away from him, right? So a food web is way more accurate when we look at what is happening with energy in an ecosystem. So as you can see, energy is flowing in a lot of different directions in this ecosystem, but where did it all originate? From those producers, those phytoplankton. This is probably a good time to talk about how sometimes the most important parts of an ecosystem are the parts you don't see. When we go outside and appreciate nature, we're probably looking at things like big oak trees, or looking at the pretty birds flying in the air, or the sense of wonder you feel when you see a deer go across your lawn or something. We don't think about these tiny little bacteria or the tiny little plants, or when we look out in the ocean, we don't think about the little phytoplankton, but these guys are really important players in ecosystems, which I think is fascinating. So, last thing we're going to talk about in this video is going to be an energy pyramid. So, a food chain shows the direction of energy flow. A food web expands upon that and shows it for a whole ecosystem. An energy pyramid is going to deal with numbers. It's going to model the amount of energy transfer in a food chain. Like I said before, the amount of energy available in each level is going to decrease as each organism will eat the next. I'll explain what that means. That's why we have a pyramid. It's going to show us what I mean by that. So, this is an example of an energy pyramid. It looks very similar to a food chain, only it's a pyramid shape. The reason why is because it's showing that as you go up that food chain, you're going to notice that you see the pyramid getting smaller and smaller up at the top, where you have the hawk. This is like the first food chain I showed you. That's the smallest because he gets the least energy from eating the snake. Okay? Now, remember how we said we have producers and consumers? Look at how we have these weird names in front of consumers. Primary consumers are going to be our herbivores. Secondary consumers are going to be carnivores or omnivores, and then tertiary consumers are almost always carnivores. So primary, secondary, and tertiary. Now sometimes you have something that eats the tertiary consumers. Those would be quaternary consumers. But the populations of those are going to be really, really, really small, because you're going to have fewer and fewer of each of these species as you go up the pyramid too. This doesn't just show us that the energy gets smaller. It also shows us that the populations will get smaller, because to have a big population, you need a lot of energy, right? And this makes a lot of just common sense. If you go outside right now and I ask you to find a living thing, you will be able to find a heck ton of plants, right? That's because they have the most energy available to them, because they can do photosynthesis. They can make their own food. Now, if I ask you to find an animal, a consumer, that might be a little bit harder. You might be able to find some bugs, okay, which are, some of them will be herbivores and eat the plant, so you might find some of those. You might find some birds or squirrels or rabbits, things like that. It's going to be a little bit harder to find a snake. It's going to be way harder to find a hawk or a fox or a coyote or a bear or something like that. That's because the population needs the energy as well. So, by how much does the energy decrease as we go up this energy pyramid? Well, like I said before, the producers are going to make all their own food. So 100% of the energy that they got from the sun is going to be theirs. Now, as we go up, we're going to lose a lot of that energy. The primary consumers, these rabbits that eat those plants, will only get 10% of that energy that those producers produced. Now, the snake will eat the rabbit. The snake only gets 1% of that initial energy. And finally, the hawk will get 0.1% of the energy available from those initial plants. So, as we go up that energy pyramid, the amount of energy reduces greatly. And that's going to be reflected in the populations of the species that will be within that energy pyramid. So really interesting things. This also is going to show us why we don't have energy cycling back through an ecosystem. By the time it gets up to our tertiary consumer, a lot of it is lost, again, quote unquote lost. It's not going to be gone forever. It doesn't just disappear. Where did all this energy go? Well, it would have been transferred, like here, they actually put quote unquote lost in this graphic that I used. It's going to be lost to things like heat and movement and sound. So the energy is going to transfer very easily. And that's why there's going to be less of that chemical energy available as we go up each level. By the way, each of these levels are called trophic levels, T-R-O-P-H-I-C, trophic levels. And they are going to be our different links in our food chain, if you will. So I want to thank you for listening today and watching. This was kind of a long episode, but we had a lot to talk about, and I will just have to admit that I love this so much. As I've told you before, biology is my jam. I would like to ask you to please make sure that you like and subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.